At the beginning of the story, we can see the entire area engraved with flames. A man with a long and sharp blade in his hand is approaching a person who seems to be overwhelmed by his presence. The guy with the blade in his hands was Jack. He is a serial killer who enjoys killing people. Jack approaches the only person alive in the building. He says that humans become weak when they are faced with ruthless violence. As Jack was getting closer, the helpless man decided to fire a bullet at him. But to his surprise, Jack sliced the bullet with his blade into multiple pieces and sliced that man to death as well. Overjoyed by the kill, Jack laughs like a lunatic and enjoys the moment. Meanwhile, the protagonist, who was still a child back then, witnesses the entire scene and watches his brutally murdered parents dead on the floor. 10 years have passed since the protagonist, Sayuli, is chilling on the rooftop of his high school when he suddenly hears a disturbance there. He could see a bunch of bullies bullying a kid who was getting beaten for not giving them his money. The head of the bully proceeds to light his cigarette. Lee steps in to grab a look at the lighter, but the bully tries to launch a punch at him. Before the bully could land the punch, Lee punched him in the face. Watching their leader fall from a single punch, the other bullies charged at Lee, but the outcome wasn't anything different from what their leader had received. Seeing this, the bullied kid works up to him and starts thanking him, but Lee tells him to get lost because he never intended to get into the scene to save him. Seeing him off guard, the leader pulls out his knife and charges at Lee, but Lee manages to save himself from getting stabbed in the back, but he gets his hand pierced instead. Lee blows a punch at him, and this time he gets completely unconscious. He pulls the knife out of his palm, and surprisingly, his body heals the cut immediately. He looked for the lighter the bully leader had, and he was certain that the lighter Jack used 10 years ago had the same mark on it as this one. He puts the lighter in his pocket and leaves the spot. Lee is back in his house, and he finally manages to frame the only image he had managed to fetch of his parents during the incident 10 years ago. After that incident, he only had one goal to accomplish. He wanted to kill the murderer of his parents with his own hands. But the only problem was that he didn't have any information about Jack's true identity. According to the rumors, some said that Jack's motive was to sell their organs, and some said that he was a war veteran who suffered from PTSD. Though nothing strongly pinpointed anything about Jack. But all these theories shared one common trait. Jack's strength transcended the human realm. The only way for him to defeat such a monster is by getting stronger. Lee says that nothing makes him stronger than fighting. He receives a DM from the bully leader, who asks him to come to the construction site behind the mountain. He tells Park Soon-mak, the CEO of a service company, that the chances of Lee coming to the site are very low. But Soon-mak was sure that he would arrive. He says that Lee had changed 12 schools before, and all of them were his decisions. The ironic reason for his transfer was that he had no one else left to fight with. The bully leader gets overwhelmed after hearing that and panics. He says that they had no way of defeating such a monster. But before he can complete his sentence, he is cut short by Soon-mak's laughter. Soon-mak says that he wasn't weak like others. He was rather special. He was one of the contract holders. Lee arrives at the construction site, but he is unable to find him anywhere. He suddenly hears a scream and runs towards it. He spots the head of Soon-mak lying on the ground, sliced apart from his body. Upon looking a little further, he could see Jack grabbing the neck of the bully leader. Lee is shocked and outraged to see him. 10 minutes before this, Soon-mak explains to the bully that, in exchange for superhuman powers, they have to kill regularly. Surprised by what Soon-mak just said, he starts asking questions, but before he can continue, he is stopped by Soon-mak. He had noticed someone watching them from the shadows. To his surprise, it was none other than Jack. Terrorized by Jack's presence, he launches the nut and bolts from his mouth, but he gets his mouth blocked by Jack. Unable to cancel the launch, the screws explode in his mouth, and his face gets obliterated. Seeing such things, the bully, Park Sun-hoon, runs for his life, but Jack blocks his path and grabs him by the neck. Jack says that he will finish him in a flash and he won't feel any pain. But then suddenly Jack spots Lee standing right next to him. He was surprised to know someone who knew his name, and Lee made him want to play with him. Jack asks Lee to wait for a second so that he can finish dealing with Sun-hoon. Lee charges at Jack and manages to save Sun-hoon from him. Then he turns back and says that instead of playing, he will take off Jack's head. Jack seemed overjoyed after hearing that. Jack and Lee are now in a brawl. Jack is launching punches at Lee one after another, but to his surprise, Lee manages to dodge every single one of them. Surprised by Lee's movements, he thought that Lee had foreseeing powers, but in reality, he learned about his movements from the dark web and prepared an evasion against them. Jack proceeds to launch a punch at him again, but this time he pours his strength into his punch, making it impossible for Lee to dodge. Lee receives a punch in his stomach, which makes him lose his breath and crushes all of his ribs and organs. Lee is breathless, but he soon recovers from that damage because he has super regenerative powers. He stands back and tells Jack that it is just the beginning. Out of curiosity, Jack asked him about his true powers and where he got to know about his identity. Lee responds and tells him that they have met before, exactly 10 years ago. Jack remembers his face, while Lee starts pulling random punches on Jack. He is easily able to dodge the punches, but suddenly Lee pulls out a knife and manages to cut a tiny portion of his neck. But unfortunately, Jack lands another punch on his stomach, which obliterates his ribs again. Jack says that if this goes on, it might become unbearable for him. He found all this exhilarating. After seeing Lee recover after receiving such a deadly punch, he finally realizes that he didn't have any foreseeing powers. Perhaps it was a super regenerative power. He says that he has killed numerous people in his life, but a super regenerative guy is a first for him. He says that he was going to experiment and see what happens when a limb is cut off from Lee's body. He then throws his blade towards Lee and chops off his leg. He wanted to check whether his limbs could grow back. Engulfed in pain, Lee falls to the ground. Jack finally concludes that his severed limb won't grow back, and now he has to eliminate him fast as his time is running out. He starts pouring gasoline on the floor and proceeds to ignite it with his lighter. But surprisingly, the lighter didn't ignite, and a spray of poison got spread on his face. Previously, during the brawl, Lee had managed to switch his lighter with the one Jack had because he knew that during all his previous murders, he used to ignite everything around the scene as a token of victory. Jack screams in pain and shouts that he has been through this countless times, so this small amount of poison was nothing for him, but he wouldn't forgive Lee for doing this. Suddenly, Lee gets a hold of Jack's sword and slices his head off his body. Lee says that it was thanks to him that he got to know a few more facts about his powers. Severed parts of his body did not regenerate, but connecting the detached body parts was possible. After slicing Jack's head off, Lee screams his chest off because he had managed to avenge his parents by killing their murderer. Suddenly, he could hear Jack's voice telling him that he was still well and alive. He turns back, and he is surprised to see that Jack didn't die even after Lee slashed his head. Even Jack was surprised to see himself alive. Lee is outraged after seeing him talk, so he grabs his head, shouts at him, and asks him to explain why he could still be breathing after his head got chopped off from his body. Unhappy with his answer, Lee smashes his head onto the ground. He says that it doesn't matter because he is going to kill him again and again until he counts his last breath. Lee picks up the sword and proceeds to slice him again, but before he can proceed, Jack asks him whether he has given up on avenging his parents because Jack was not the one who killed his parents and that there was another contract holder present in that tower 10 years ago. He says that he slices off his prey, but in the past, Lee's parents had slashes, but none of their limbs or necks were sliced off. Lee shouts and tells him to cut the bullcrap because he does not believe what Jack has said. He suddenly hears a sound, and he discovers that Sun Hoon is about to gain back his consciousness. Jack suggests Lee move to another location. Things might get tedious if he wakes up and sees them. Now we could see Sun Hoon sitting in his classroom and remembering all the things that had happened that night. His friends were surprised to think that Sun Hoon was able to get rid of the transfer student because Lee hadn't been to school for 3 whole days. After hearing that, he was sure that if something happened to Lee, he was doomed for sure. That day, when Sun Hoon got his consciousness, he saw the sliced up neck of the contract holder, and he thought that all of it was just a dream. But now that he realizes that all of it was true, he fears that Lee was also killed that day, which indirectly means that Sun Hoon is the reason for Lee's death. He thinks that this is the reason why Lee is not coming to school anymore. To relieve the stress, he goes to the rooftop to smoke a cigarette, but his younger twin sister, Park Sun-joon, tosses the cigarette out of his hand and starts scolding him for always making a fuss in school. Sun-joon says that she is humiliated because of him. Sun Hoon tells her to scram, but she says that he messed with the transfer student this time. Before she could continue, she was asked to stop by the other member of the student council, Choi Ji-ha. He wanted to ask a few questions about Lee from Sun Hoon, as he was the only one who had ever communicated with him at the school. With hesitation, Sun Hoon tells Ji-ha to ask the students of his class, but to his surprise, Ji-ha is a classmate of Lee's. But apparently, Lee hasn't communicated with anyone in his classroom either. Seeing this, Sun Hoon says that Lee had nothing to do with him, nor did he know him well. Jiha says that they had no other chance than to go to Lee's house to check on him. Meanwhile, Jack was explaining everything about the contract holder with crazy superpowers. He says that people who get away after committing numerous murders with superpowers go beyond the law. Due to their power, punishment is impossible for these monsters. Lee finally realizes that on that day, 10 years ago, there was another contract holder aside from Jack. He asks whether Lee has started to believe in him or not, but Lee shoots and tells him to shut up and answer all his questions, or he will kill him right away. Lee asks him the identity of the other contract holder, but unfortunately, he has no idea about the other contract holder. Lee gets outraged after hearing that and attempts to kill him. However, he stops midway because Jack has something to tell him. He says that at some point after that incident 10 years ago, he blacked out, and after that day, he doesn't remember a single thing. He tells Lee that he was also curious to know the other contract holder's identity, but Lee was sure that, in the end, he was surely going to kill Jack. Now that Sun-hoon and Ji-ha can be seen going to Lee's house, Sun-hoon is still anxious to know whether Lee is still alive or not. They finally arrive at his house and knock on the door, but unfortunately, no one has responded from inside. Ji-ha notices that the door is not open, but he somehow manages to open it. When Sun-hoon asks how he could do such a thing, Ji-ha says that and proceeds to get inside. Upon entering his house, Ji-ha notices something that Sun-hoon wasn't aware of and tells Sun-hoon that he knows exactly what had happened to Lee. Sun-hoon was super tense after hearing that. Ji-ha picks up a hammer without letting Sun-hoon notice it and asks him to help him out. Previously, Jack was explaining that the killers, who are known as contract holders, would circulate around the dark web, called the Land of Nod, in order to find contracts. However, the only way to get into this dark web is by purchasing a smartphone with a special pre-installed app through the black market. Following his explanation, he gets to the place where Jack thought that the black market was situated. However, to their surprise, the room is empty with no sign of human presence or anything. Enraged after finding nothing in that room, he smashes his backpack on the ground and says that he got played by Jack. Suddenly, he receives a message from Choi Ji-ha, where he mentions that if Lee is curious about the contract holders, he should meet him to learn more about them. A moment later, he attaches an image of Sun-hoon lying unconscious on the ground. Unable to figure out the situation, he decides to meet him. Meanwhile, Sun-hoon gets back to his consciousness, and he is greeted by Ji-ha. Ji-ha says that he was worried that Sun-hoon would die on him because, previously, he used the hammer to strike a hit on Sun-hoon. Ji-ha tells him that if he feels too much pain, he can get painkillers for him. Sun-hoon couldn't process a single thing, nor did he know where he was or the reason behind Ji-ha's actions. Suddenly, Sun-hoon spots the anatomical human model situated right behind where Ji-ha is standing and gets freaked out. To calm him, Ji-ha says that those were fake, and he further adds that he had disposed of all the real ones. While he was making Sun-hoon freak out more, he suddenly realized that a projectile weapon was being thrown at him, and surprisingly enough, he managed to dodge the blade. Ji-ha quickly realizes that it is none other than Lee and greets him. In return, Lee asks him who he is, to which Ji-ha replies that he is a fellow classmate. Lee says that he wanted to know whether he was one of the contract holders or not. Ji-ha says that he doesn't know about that, but he had one of the smartphones sold on the black market. Lee quickly charges at Ji-ha to get hold of the smartphone, but to his surprise, Ji-ha easily dodges him and blows a punch at him. Ji-ha tells Lee that he didn't call him there to fight, but rather because he wanted to help him out. Previously, at Lee's house, he found the notebook that Lee possessed lying on the table and gave it a read. From there, he got to know that he was interested in the contract holders. Upon knowing this, Lee tells him that he read his notebook like a thief, and thus he wouldn't want any help from Ji-ha. He drops his bard, raises his sword, and tells him that he can still take the smartphone from him after finishing him off. Ji-ha says that he was talking to a wall all along, and that he now has to show him his potential as a fighter. He says that the thought of killing him is impossible. He charges at Lee, but to his surprise, Lee blocks his punch with the blade's base. Ji-ha backs off, grabs the hammer, and asks Lee whether he would be able to block his hammer. Again, Ji-ha charges at Lee with the hammer and keeps striking him one after another, but Lee manages to block most of them, but unfortunately, he can't block the last hit and gets his shoulder tapped by the hammer. The blade fell from Lee's hand, and he had to back off. Lee says that there is still a long way to go, but he soon realizes that his leftover arm cannot heal itself. Ji-ha explains that he had used the hammer to inflict damage on the acupoints, which made his arm paralyzed, and that he wouldn't be able to use it for the next 5 hours. Jiha tells him to stop being so persistent and hands over the hammer to Lee. Jiha reminds him that he doesn't want to fight him, and that if he wants his help getting a contract holder smartphone, he will happily agree to help him. However, before that, he asks Lee to prove one thing to him. He tells him that killing is essential for contract holders, so to become a contract holder, you need to be able to kill people. He tells him to prove to him that he is worthy of being one of them. He asks him to use the hammer to smash Sun Hoon's head with the hammer. After hearing that, Lee asked Jiha whether that was all he wanted him to do to prove himself, to which he replied that it was exactly what he wanted and that he didn't go back on his words. Lee picks up the hammer and quickly throws it where Jiha is standing. Watching the hammer come at him, Jiha manages to catch the hammer before it hits his head. However, Lee gets enough time to pick up his blade, and he manages to inflict a cut on his forehead. He says that Jiha wanted him to prove himself, whether he was capable of killing people, so it didn't matter whose head it was. Enraged by what Lee did to him, Jiha says that there's no use in negotiating with Lee. Lee regrets inflicting a deeper cut, so he proceeds to charge at Jiha with his blade. But this time, Jiha fights back and manages to paralyze his right arm as well. He says that he was excited to meet a newbie who was a classmate. He wanted to support him with all he could and become a friend he could rely on, but he ruined everything. Jiha launches a punch at Lee before it can hit his face. Lee knew that he could easily block that punch, but to his surprise, he had forgotten that Jiha had managed to paralyze both of his arms, and now he had no other chance of blocking the punch. Jiha says that he has changed his mind. Instead of being an accomplice to Lee, Jiha will be using Lee's body for research and killing him once he's done, as planned. Unable to understand what he was speaking about, he asked him what he meant by that. Jiha replies that the moment he came to his house, he was ready to retrieve a body, regardless of whether it was dead or alive. Jiha further adds that it was his hobby to collect corpses and conduct experiments on them. He was excited to retrieve Lee's body because Lee was an orphan, and he thought it would be nice to conduct an experiment on someone whom no one cared about. Suddenly, Lee charges at him with a kick. However, he manages to dodge the first attack, but to his surprise, Lee turns around and launches a kick at Jiha with his other leg, which makes him lose control of his balance and fall to the ground. Jiha calls him feisty and tells him that this time he's going to paralyze his legs as well so that he won't move a single inch. Jiha suddenly spots Lee, says that he doesn't need any help, and starts unzipping his bag, unable to understand the situation. Jiha doesn't move an inch, and Lee further says that he has no other choice, so he has to do it. Jiha thought Lee was talking to him, but he suddenly spotted a head coming out of Lee's backpack. It was Jack. Jack tells him that he knew that this wasn't going to be this easy. Jiha is surprised to see a human head talk. We are brought back to the day when Lee brought Jack home and started asking him questions. Unable to find answers to his questions, Lee says that he must be a moron to expect anything from Jack. So he picks up the blade and swings it toward Jack, and he comes to the conclusion that if he doesn't find out who killed his parents, all the contract holders, including Jack, will have to die by his hands. Lee gives him two options to choose from, whether he wanted to die right then or help him kill all the contract holders and die last. Jack decided to keep helping him rather than dying first. We are brought back to the present. Jack asks Lee about what sort of help he wants. Lee says that he already knows the answer and tells him to bite his arms. Upon seeing that, he realizes what Lee is actually thinking and proceeds to stop him. He says that he didn't know what that head was and that they were underestimating him too much. However, it was too late. He realizes that Lee was not commanding Jack to bite Jiha. Perhaps it was for himself. He couldn't believe what just happened. He thought that Lee hated the idea of being an experimental tool, so he might have decided to commit suicide before Jiha could experiment on his body. But soon enough, when he watched Lee stand tall on the ground with his functional hand, all the laughter on his face was gone. He could see the biting parts start to heal. Jack observes that Lee's healing powers were not triggered due to the injuries being too mild, and hence he incurs damage to himself. Jack finds Lee very interesting. Upon seeing his super healing powers, Jiha claims that he was able to fool him well. However, it won't make a huge difference. Jiha charges at Lee with the hammer in his hand, but instead gets punched in the stomach. He charges at Lee again with his hammer, but Lee manages to dodge the attack and strike again at him. Unable to digest the punches he had received, he tells Lee not to get cocky just because he was able to inflict a few lucky strikes at him. But soon enough he realizes that both his hands have been paralyzed. Unable to move his arms, He receives a punch in the face. Lee says that he finally managed to figure him out completely.